Book of Heaven, Volume 27, Part 3. October 21st, 1929. Parallel between the coming of the Word upon earth and the divine will. I was feeling all concerned about the divine fiat. 1,000 thoughts crowded my mind with what my sweet Jesus had told me about it, especially on its reigning. And then I was saying to myself, but does the divine will reign upon earth now? It is true that it is everywhere. There is not one point in which it does not exist. But does it hold its scepter, its absolute command in the midst of creatures? But while my mind wandered amid many thoughts, my lovable Jesus, coming out from within me, told me, "My daughter, my divine will reigns. It can be paralleled to me, eternal Word, who, in descending from heaven, enclosed myself in the womb of my celestial mother. Who knew anything? No one. Not even Saint Joseph knew, at the beginning of my conception, that I was already in their midst. Only my inseparable mamma was aware of everything. So the great portent of my descent from heaven upon earth had occurred, and in reality. And while with my immensity I existed everywhere, heaven and earth were immersed in me. With my person, I was enclosed in the maternal womb of the Immaculate Queen. No one knew me. I was ignored by all. And so, my daughter, here is the first step of the parallel between me, divine Word, when I descended from heaven, and my divine will, that takes its first step to come to reign upon earth. Just as I directed my first steps toward the Virgin Mother, so did my will direct its first steps in you. And as it asked for your will, and you surrendered it, it immediately formed its first act of conception in your soul. And as it manifested its knowledges, giving you as though many divine sips, it formed its life and gave start to the formation of its kingdom. But for a long time, who knew anything? No one. Only you and I were aware of everything. And after some time, my representative, the one who directed you, became aware of what was happening in you. Symbol of my representative, Saint Joseph, who was to appear as my father before creatures, and who, before I came out of the maternal womb, had the great honor and gift of knowing that I was already in their midst. After the first steps, I took the second. I went to Bethlehem to be born, and I was recognized and visited by the shepherds of that place. But they were not influential people. They kept for themselves the beautiful news that I had already come upon earth. Therefore they did not occupy themselves with making me known, with spreading me everywhere. And I continued to remain the Jesus hidden and unknown to all. But, though unknown, I was already in their midst, symbol of my divine will. Very often, other representatives of mine have come to you, from afar and from nearby, who have listened to the beautiful news of the kingdom of my divine will, the knowledges about it, and how it wants to be recognized. But some for lack of influence, some of will, they did not occupy themselves with spreading it, and it remained unknown and ignored, even though it already exists in their midst. But because it is not known, it does not reign. It reigns only in you, just as I was only with my celestial Mama and with my foster father, Saint Joseph. The third step of my coming upon earth is the exile, and I had this because the holy Magi came to visit me, who aroused some interest in searching for me. This search of me made Herod fearful, and instead of joining with them to come to visit me, he wanted to plot against my life in order to kill me. And by necessity I was forced to go into exile. Symbol of my divine will. Very often it seems that they arouse some interest. Very often it seems that they arouse some interest, that they want to make it known by publishing it. But nothing. Some are taken by fear. Some are afraid to compromise themselves. Some do not feel like sacrificing themselves. Now with one pretext, now with another, everything ends up in words. And my divine will remains exiled from the midst of creatures. And just as I did not depart for heaven, but in the exile I remained in the midst of creatures, only with my divine mother and with Saint Joseph, who knew me very well, and I formed their paradise on earth, while for others it was as if I did not exist. In the same way, having formed its life in you, with all the cortege of its knowledges, if it does not receive the effects, the purpose for which it has made itself known, how can my fiat depart? In fact, when we decide to do a work, a good, no one can move us. Therefore, in spite of the exile and of its hiddenness, just as I did, doing my public life and making myself known after 30 years of hidden life, so will my divine volition not be able to remain always hidden, but will obtain its intent of making itself known, in order to reign in the midst of creatures. Therefore be attentive, and know how to appreciate the great gift of my divine will in your soul. October 24th, 1929. How in the divine will the soul has everything in her power, because she finds the font of the divine works, and can repeat them whenever she wants. I was feeling all abandoned in the divine fiat, following and offering all of its acts, both of creation and of redemption. And as I reached the conception of the word, I said to myself, how I would like in the divine will to make the conception of the word my own, to be able to offer to the Supreme Being the love, the glory, the satisfaction, as if the word were being conceived once again. But while I was saying this, my sweet Jesus moved in my interior and told me, "My daughter, in my divine will, the soul has everything in her power. There is nothing that our divinity has done, both in creation and in redemption, whose font our divine fiat does not possess. In fact, it disperses nothing of our acts, but rather it is the depository of everything. And one who possesses our divine volition possesses the font of my conception, of my birth, of my tears, of my steps, of my works, of everything. Our acts are never exhausted, and as she remembers and wants to offer my conception is renewed as if I were being conceived again. I rise again to new birth. My tears, my pains, my steps and works rise again to new life and repeat the great good that I did in redemption. So one who lives in our divine will is the repeater of our works, because just as nothing in the creation has been dispersed of what was created, so is everything of redemption an act of arising continuously. But who gives us the spur? Who gives us the occasion to move our fonts in order to renew our works? One who lives in our will. By virtue of it, the creature takes part in our creative strength. Therefore she can make everything rise again to new life. With her acts, with her offerings, with her supplications, she moves our fonts continuously, which, moved as though by a pleasant breeze, form the waves, and overflowing with our acts, multiply and grow to infinity. Our fonts are symbolized by the sea. If the wind does not agitate it, if the waves are not formed, the waters do not overflow outside, and the cities do not get wet. The same with our fonts of our so many works. If our divine fiat does not want to move them, or if one who lives in it gives no thought to forming any breeze with her acts, even though they are filled to the brim, they do not overflow outside to multiply their goods for the good of creatures. In addition to this, with one who lives in our divine fiat, as she keeps forming her acts, these acts ascend to the beginning from which the creature came out. They do not remain down below, but ascend so very high to look for the bosom of the one from whom the first act of her existence came out. These acts line up around the beginning, which is God, as divine acts. In seeing the acts of the creature in his divine will, God recognizes them as his acts, and feels loved and glorified as he wants, with his very love and with his own glory. October 27th, 1929. Why the kingdom of the divine will could not come before the coming of our Lord upon earth. The graft of Jesus Christ and the graft of Adam. I was doing my round in the creation, and I was following all the acts done by the divine fiat, from Eden up to the descent of the divine word upon earth. But while I was doing this, I thought to myself, And why did the kingdom of the divine will not come upon earth before the Son of God came from heaven to earth? And my sweet Jesus, taking the occasion from what I was thinking, or rather, it seems to me that when he wants to speak to me, he gives me the reflections. He makes doubts and difficulties arise in me, and the desire to know many things about his kingdom. While when he does not want to speak to me, my mind is silent. I am unable to reflect upon anything, and I go through the acts of the divine will within its light. So, my lovable Jesus, coming out from within my interior, told me, "My daughter, the kingdom of my divine will could not come upon earth before my coming to it, because there was no humanity which possessed, as much as it is possible for a creature, the fullness of my divine fiat. And not possessing it, there was no right, either according to the divine order or according to the human order. Heaven was closed. The two wills, human and divine, were as though scowling at each other. Man felt himself in the impossibility of asking for a good so great, so much so that he would not even think about it. By right of justice, God was in the impossibility of giving it. Before my coming upon earth, God and the creature were with each other like the earth and the sun. The earth does not possess the seed, with which, by pulverizing it, it may form the shoot, in order to form the plant of that seed. The sun, not finding the shoot, cannot communicate the effects it possesses, so as to be able to form, with its vivifying virtue, the development and the formation of that plant. So, earth and sun are as though foreign to each other. It can be said, if they had reason, that they would as though scowl at each other. For the earth cannot produce and receive that good, and the sun cannot give it. Such was the state of humanity without the seed of my fiat. And if there is no seed, it is useless to hope for the plant. Now, with my coming upon earth, the divine Word clothed himself with human flesh, and by this he formed the graft with the tree of humanity. My humanity lent itself as seed to the eternal Word, and my divine will formed the new graft with my human will. From this, since I was the head of all human generations, began the right on both sides, human and divine, for them to be able to receive the kingdom of my divine will, for God to be able to give it. Now, when a graft is made, it does not immediately assimilate the strength of the new humors, but it keeps assimilating the new humors of that graft little by little. Therefore, at the very beginning it gives few fruits, but as it keeps forming, the fruits increase. They are bigger and more tasty, until the whole tree is formed, loaded with branches and fruits. Such is the graft made by me with the tree of humanity. About 2,000 years have passed, and humanity has not received all the humors of my graft. But there is reason to hope, because the seed, the graft, is there, and therefore the creature can ask for it. God finds himself in the possibility of giving it, because there is my humanity, which, possessing my divine will by nature, by virtue of the Word made flesh, has given back the rights to man and to God. Therefore, everything I did in redemption is nothing other than preparation, watering, cultivation, to give development to this celestial graft made by me between the two wills, the human and the divine. So how could the kingdom of my divine will come before my coming upon earth if the graft was missing, as well as the principle of its life, its operating and act in the soul, and its first act in the act of the human work, in order to extend its kingdom in each of their acts? It is true that my divine Fiat, with its power and immensity, extended its empire everywhere. But in the human will, it was not present as principle of life, but only by power and immensity. It was in the condition in which the sun and earth find themselves. The sun invests the earth with its light, and it also gives its effects. But the earth does not become sun, and the sun does not become earth, because sun and earth do not fuse together in such a way as to form life one within the other, and therefore they are always foreign bodies which do not look alike. And as much as the sun illuminates it, warms it, communicates its admirable effects, since it does not communicate its life, nor does the earth surrender its rights of life in the sun, the earth will always be earth, and the sun will always be sun. Such is the state my divine will was and is in. Until man surrenders his will in mine, mine cannot cast its principle of life in the human will. The fusion of one with the other cannot take place. The creature will always be creature, without the likeness and the life of her creator in the depth of her soul, which only my divine Fiat can form. Therefore, there will always be dissimilarity, distance, even though my divine volition illuminates it and communicates to it its admirable effects out of its goodness and liberality, and by the effect of the power and immensity which it possesses by its own nature. More so since, by sinning, by doing his human will, Adam not only formed the woodworm in the root of the tree of humanity, but he added the graft to it, a graft which communicated all the bad humors that in the course of the centuries the graft of Adam would produce in the tree of humanity. At the beginning, a graft can produce neither great goods nor great evils, but only the beginning of evil or of good. In fact, Adam did not do the many evils of the human generations, but made only the graft, and was yet the cause of torrents of evils. More so since he did not have immediately the opposite graft of my coming upon earth, but centuries upon centuries were to pass. Therefore the bad humors kept growing, and the evils multiplied, and so the kingdom of my will could not even be thought of. But when I came upon earth, with my conception, I formed the opposite graft with the tree of humanity, and the evils began to stop, the bad humors to be destroyed. So there is all the hope that the kingdom of my divine will be formed in the midst of the human generations. The many truths I have manifested to you about my divine fiat are sips of life, some of which water, some cultivate, some increase the humors for the tree of humanity grafted by me. Therefore, if the life of my divine fiat has entered into the tree of my humanity and has formed the graft, there is all the reason to hope that my kingdom will have its scepter, its just dominion, and its command in the midst of creatures. Therefore, pray and do not doubt. October 30th, 1929. One who lives in the divine will can go around in all the works of God and acquires the divine rights. The sweet enchantment of the omnipotent fiat keeps me as though eclipsed in it with its light, and I can see nothing but all of its acts. To place my I love you as a seal upon each one of its acts, in order to ask for the kingdom of its divine will in the midst of creatures. Now before my mind I saw a great wheel of light, which filled the whole earth. And while the center of the wheel was all one light, many rays were sticking out around it, for as many acts as the divine fiat had done. And I moved from one ray to another to place on them the seal of my I love you, to then leave it in each ray, asking continuously for the kingdom of its divine will. Now, while I was doing this, my always lovable Jesus, coming out of my interior, told me, "My daughter, with one who lives in my divine will and forms her acts in it, these acts remain as the work of the creature, binding God to give her the rights of a kingdom so holy, and therefore the rights to make it known and to make it reign upon earth. In fact, the soul who lives in my fiat reacquires all the acts of it done for love of creatures. God renders her the conqueror not only of his will, but of all creation. There is not one act of it in which the creature does not place her act, be it even one I love you, one I adore you, and so forth. So, having placed something of her own, everything remains bound, and my fiat feels happy, because finally it has found the fortunate creature to whom it can give what it wanted to give with so much love from the very beginning of the creation of all the universe. Therefore, by living in my divine will, the creature enters into the divine order. She becomes the proprietor of its works, and by right she can give and ask for others that which is her own. And since she lives in it, her rights are divine, and she asks by a right that is divine, not human. Each of her acts is a call that she makes to her Creator, and with his very divine empire she says to him, "Give me the kingdom of your divine will, that I may give it to creatures, so that it may reign in their midst, and all of them may love you with divine love, and be all reordered in you." Now you must know that every time you go around in my will to put something of your own, it is one more divine right that you acquire to ask for a kingdom so holy. This is why, as you go around in it, all the works of creation come forward before you, and all those of redemption line up around you, waiting for you, so as to receive, each one of them, your act, to give you the requital of the act of our works. And you keep tracing them one by one, to recognize them, embrace them, to place your little I love you and your kiss of love to make a purchase of them. In our Fiat, there is neither yours nor mine between creator and creature, but everything is communion, and therefore by right she can ask for whatever she wants. Oh, how afflicted and sorrowful I would feel amid so many pains and acts of mine done while I was on earth, if the little daughter of my will did not even recognize them, and did not try to place around my act the cortege of her love and of her act. How could I give you the right if you did not recognize them? And even less could you make them your own. Recognizing our works is not only a right that we give, but possession. Therefore, if you want my divine will to reign, always go around in our Fiat. Recognize all our works, from the smallest to the greatest. Place your act in each one of them, and everything will be granted to you. You have reached the end of the Book of Heaven, Volume 27, Part 3. Fiat.